Well, hello and good golly gosh there, everybody. How you doing today? Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about my favorite Space Marine chapter, which is a Space Marine chapter I made up because, I'm just like super creative like that. I bet you're super creative too and have your own little Space Marine chapter. Or Craft World. Or Sisters of Battle Order? I think they're called orders. I'm not actually 100% sure on that. Or clan, you know, all kinds of things. Now, of course, I also have my own craft world, and they're actually tied into these guys, and I'm going to go over how here as I talk about it. But yeah, I just figured it would be a bit of fun to talk about how these guys came about and why I like them so much, and some of the backstory I wrote for them and things like that. And yeah, this is basically their color scheme. It's I've experimented with different kinds of like this sort of teal and stuff like that, and black mostly. And of course, their name is the Rift Drakes. They used to be called the Rift Scimitars, but then they changed their name, and I'll go into why they changed their name and all that as I talk a little bit about them. Maybe you guys will find that cool. Also, this is kind of the style I wanted to go with most of them, were like the black helmet and like the teal body. I thought that looks pretty cool, but like in this particular version of Dawn of War, and this is Dawn of War Ultimate Apocalypse that I have installed here. Oh no, I've accidentally turned them purple! No! Okay, good. I just want to make sure they didn't accidentally turn purple, because that was not the color! That was not the perfect color I had intended! Oh gosh dang it, I keep doing that. But yeah. So that's basically what they kind of look like. They got like the teal and the black there and some gold and stuff like that. And I think you guys will hopefully like it. And I tried to make them unique and interesting, and I will admit that in some places I bent the lore a little bit just so I could make the story I wanted to make. But hey, it is what it is. I kind of have, in some sense, two slightly separate versions of them. One that is more lore accurate and one that is less lore accurate, but like is more of the story I want to tell, and I'll kind of go into that as I go through it. But actually, oh, and just to clarify real quick, I'm playing Ultimate Apocalypse, but because I'm going to be talking and not really paying attention too much, I've just put on cheats. I just have God mode on, and I just have infinite resources and all that other stuff so that I can just build big things while I talk about this. That's so if you're like, oh man, he's going to show us his cool tactics. Not in this particular video. I might, if I want to later, come back to Dawn of War and show you some of my actual playing of it. But right now, it's mostly just going to be me messing around, and this is not my first time playing it. I don't know why it keeps doing that. It keeps saying that it. Oh, I think it's doing. I think it actually, I accidentally agreed to the tutorial, didn't I? I should have just read that instead of just saying yes. Would you? Well, it said, would you like to play? And I was like, oh, well, yes, I would like to play. I'm silly boy like that. But hey, that's going to go into actually part of our story, interestingly enough. But I will start us out while this is loading, going through the actual beginning of our story. And the actual beginning of our story doesn't start in Warhammer 40k or even the Horus Heresy. It starts before then. You see, this area of space is actually next, that these guys occupy is next to the Ghoul Stars, or like in the Ghoul Stars, like way out there on the northeastern fringe of the galaxy. They were originally populated by a group of traveling people from like nomadic peoples from Terra and various other places that kind of gathered together, and they have like some African influences, some Arabic influences. So like they have Arabic peoples, African peoples, Persian peoples, Tibetan peoples, and a wide variety of others that kind of mixed together and coalesced into one sort of distinct group of people as they went across the stars. And they picked up people along the way, but they never really settled anywhere until they got way out. And they went way out, partially because they were trying, at least in theory, to avoid like the more authoritarian governments, and the idea was that they wanted to avoid all the other governments and just like create their own sort of thing, right? That was their...
Welcome to the Dawn of War tutorial.
Shush, 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 shush. I shouldn't have said yes to you. But anyway, so basically the idea was that they were trying to get away from all these various different kinds of authority, and they kind of attracted a bunch of different random groups to them as they traveled around. Eventually, though, they would get to this area out in the Ghoul Stars. By this time, they had gathered all kinds of different weirdos and different, you know, like, people who were, like, experimenting with all kinds of different minor technologies and different things like that. And they decided to, after they'd endured a long, hard journey, fighting Xenos along the way, they just decided to kind of disperse out and create a bunch of random different settlements that would sort of rely on each other and work together to be prosperous. And at first, everything was going okay. But over time, a couple of the different families on the different planets kind of started to grow bigger and more powerful, and over time, some of them started to sort of coalesce in power, and eventually it led to two different families deciding that they were going to fight against each other because they started to branch out, and they started to build colony ships and going to other planets and trying to build up their own people faster than everyone else. And as these two kind of went along, they sort of started butting heads, and then eventually it led to like all-out warfare, and they started fighting. And at first, a lot of the minor settlements just did not want to get into any of it. They just wanted to stay out of it, do their own thing. And, you know, it's like we have like these 6 different little planets that are colonizable to varying different degrees, and we're just trying to make a living, and we're just trying to do our own thing. Please keep us out of it. But as the war grew, almost all the minor factions couldn't actually stay completely out of it. So they kept getting more and more dragged into everything that was going on, until eventually they were like, everybody was at war basically. And all across these 6 planets, various different ships are going back and forth. People are blowing each other up. People are dying. All this crazy stuff was going on. And, you know, I just realized I don't think the cheats are actually working because there doesn't appear to be... Oh, well, that's fine. Yep, no, it's not giving me unlimited stuff. But that is perfectly fine. We're just going to keep building, and we're just going to play this as we normally would. And I'm going to turn down the music just a teeny tad bit more, because it does sound kind of oh, let's see, I just... Whatever, it's fine.
Reporting for duty.
I don't know if that actually turned it down at all. But anyway, so the wars kept going, and they kept getting out of hand. People were using bigger and bigger weapons against each other. By the way, during all of this, they don't know it, but like, as the rest of the galaxy is getting worse and worse, they're kind of isolated. And then, you know, basically, eventually it gets to the point where, like, you know, the terrible warp storms happen, and they can't actually get out, so now they're just, like, forced to sit there and fight with each other. And as they continue to fight with each other, and as they continue to build up their resources and build up their... As they continue to build up their resources and continue to, like, conquer things and try to, like, fight with each other, it eventually got to a point where these two families had become, like, both warlord-like families, and were now, like, kind of slowly but surely edging... Oh, Chaos Boys over there. Hey, Chaos Boys, I would prefer it if you did not try to touch my stuff. This is my stuff, not your stuff. Because, you know, we're good boys of the Emperor. What are you? You're not even good boys. You're like angry boys of the not goodness. Actually, you know what we're gonna do? I'm just gonna build that bolter, this heavy bolt gun on there, and see if it just starts shooting them.
Yes, my lord. Under fire.
Oh,
Heresy.
never mind. I guess we'll just have to do that. Pull back. Okay, now keep building. Are you guys over there? I guess go help them out.
Your command.
But yeah, so basically things just kept getting worse and worse. The violence kept escalating until eventually what you had was just like devastation and all this different stuff. And this went on for close to 1,000 years after the Horus Heresy, until eventually
We are the emperors.
one of the
Fate is our
families
source.
on, oh my goodness,
Scouts charge. Scouts advance.
Fear denies fate. Understood.
Yes, Lord.
one of the families ended up or one of the empires now had ended up getting to a point of like actually being in power. So what they
Most beneficent one.
did
We
was
are the emperors chosen.
they ended up being the first ones to get contacted by the Imperium, and they ended up getting a ton of privileges and things like that. The Imperium slowly but surely filtered into the area, taking some new plants in the name of the Emperor.
We are the emperors chosen.
A lot of these planets that they ended up getting,
Instructions.
like they ended up getting divided among various different peoples, and people, when they realized that there was a system that had been mostly devastated and only had like at this point a few sparse colonies on it, various different peoples started showing up and taking different parts of the land. So for instance, the Mechanicus ended up taking one planet. They ended up taking Abeda. I'm sorry, they ended up taking Soptu. And then there was another planet that got turned into an agricultural planet. Abeda was the agricultural planet. Kailash ended up being the planet that had the favored
For the
people
emperor.
on it.
Objective.
And that is where they ended up creating a military regiment
Yes, most beneficent
known
one.
originally as the Kailash
Build routine
First,
seven to
which
one
was the
Emperors
initiated.
chosen.
Yes, my lord. Getting
basically they
into
were like a caste-based warrior society that was trying to build up like a lot of warriors and different things like that. I might get into a little bit more detail on them later. Vyra was mostly still a feudal world with various different things kind of spread out. Armati was the planet that ended up having the Ecclesiarchy take claim of it. And Hediza ended up being a planet that still was loyal to the Imperium, but was less cultivated. There were plans to cultivate it in the future, but the various different factions that ended up coming in there were all disputing over it. And basically, due to one bureaucratic mess up after another, eventually this whole system, which was already overly like populated, or already overly like kind of stretched out between the Ecclesiarchy, the Mechanicus, and all this other stuff, was kind of like trying to spread their influence out. Eventually, it was decided that a Space Marine chapter would need to be there. The exact reasoning is still not certain to this day as to why the Space Marine chapter ended up being formed there, but they were formed. Originally, they were known as the Rift Scimitars. It was commonly believed for some time that they were actually sons of Gilliman, as in they were
Routine 7 to 1
Ultramarines,
initiated.
or descended from the Ultramarines, an Ultramarine successor chapter, and they kind of went about doing their thing.
7 to 1 initiated.
Originally, what kind of put the chapter in a weird spot was that the original chapter master found out some time ago that there was actually a huge vault underneath the planet on Vyra that had all kinds of ancient technology on it. He wanted to use this as leverage to get more resources for the Space Marines and things like that. But knowing the Mechanicus and knowing that other people will probably come and try to claim this if they found out about it, for the time being, he kind of kept it secret. They built up over time. They got a decent-sized number of Marines. They fought, had lots of crazy adventures in the Ghoul Stars, etc.
Yes, Lord.
Now, cut to
Build routine 7
about 8,000,
initiated.
8,500 years later. The Marines have existed for a very long time. They are sitting on this stockpile of ancient technology and weaponry and things like that, but they never really go in there and they haven't shared it with anybody. Now they're just kind of keeping it secret. At first, the idea was that they were going to use it for leverage, but now they've decided that if anyone ever found out about this technology that they were kind of holding for themselves down there, they would probably be in way more trouble than it was worth. So instead, they just kind of hold on to their secret technology and wait for the right time to maybe break it out and use it, or maybe they think that they can get away with just keeping it a secret for as long as they want.
Build routine
Marine squad
721
deployed.
initiated.
Direct us to the enemy.
This is when a new Marine comes into the picture. His name is Zeki.
We stand
Zeki is promoted to sergeant fairly quickly, and he is, in many ways, considered a,
Yes,
pretty good commander. But the thing that is special about Zeki is that Zeki is already having doubts about the Imperium as a whole as his career goes on. For one reason or another, and they're not really 100% sure why, the hypno training that they underwent just didn't really seem to take hold as much in them. And the Rift Drakes were already kind of loosey-goosey with this because they thought that, or the Rift Scimitars at this point, were already loosey-goosey with their whole hypno indoctrination because they had already formed the idea that it would be better if people were loyal to the chapter
Beneficent one.
more than the Imperium. They were still loyal to the Imperium, but they thought that they wanted to keep people like closer to the chapter rather than the Imperium if they could at all help it.
At your command, infiltrating enemy territory.
So, as time goes on,
Here to serve.
Zeki has more and more doubts about the things going on around him. He ends up actually becoming a captain after a while because his troops like him. He's very effective in combat. He
under fire.
tends to be able to lead people very well, and people think that he is, just a really good commander. Oh, jeez. Okay, we're gonna just back up here and we're gonna go around over here to make sure that these guys can't attack us. But the more Zeki learns about the outside Imperium, the more he learns about places outside of this system, the more he starts to realize that the Imperium is basically a crumbling mess. That everything that goes on inside of it is like a bureaucratic nightmare, and that very little is actually getting done. Every planet he's defending
Initiated.
doesn't seem like it was doing much for the Imperium before he was defending it. And it's not that he wants the people on the planets to suffer or that he doesn't want to help them, but he very quickly realizes that for a lot of the Imperium, their people are just oppressed. So he's kind of starting to become disillusioned. And it's at this time
Yes, my lord.
that he starts hearing a strange voice in the little sleep he gets in the little bout of dreams that he has, that's telling him that he needs to go down to the ancient vault of technology
I await your instructions.
and find a particular artifact.
Build routine 721.
There's nothing that says that the Marines can't go down into the ancient vaults and look for different artifacts and things like that. In fact, plenty of them do that. They meditate on some ancient technology and think about like their ancestors and things like that. But he knows that it's kind of strange to have this dream. However, he decides to go forward with it.
Your instructions.
So,
Build
as he
routine 721 initiated.
he slowly but surely decides to build up the courage, and he eventually decides to go out and he's like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna go do this. I'm going to go down into the ancient vault, and I'm gonna find this piece of technology. So, after he returns from one of his missions, a lot of his forces were battered. He ends up going down there with just a couple of his favorite sergeants and a few of his favorite Marines in his company. They go down there and they actually find that there is a chaplain waiting for them who has apparently heard the same vision and has already touched the technology. One thing leads to another. Zucky ends up finding the machine that he was looking for, that he saw in his dream, and it's this strange like device. It's like a rock, a very large, it looks like rock with like some headsets connected to it and chairs. The chaplain invites him to sit down in one of the chairs, and he does so. At first being a little suspicious, because why would the chaplain be down here? But at the same time, he was already feeling more and more like he's being pulled like by destiny, and he doesn't really know where else to go, so he just decides to go along with this. I would probably add some more detail and stuff like that if I was writing this down as like an actual story type thing, but for right now that's just about where I'm gonna have it, you know. Oh man, these scouts are just gonna have these scouts fall back a little bit, dear lord.
Squad morale restored.
I'm glad the squad morale was restored, buddy. You feeling better? You feeling good now? That's good. Anyway. He puts the device on, and he immediately finds himself teleported into, or like mentally placed into a different realm. It's basically just a huge blank space spreading out supposedly infinitely. And he finds that he's still in his armor. He has his weapon. And at first, he's kind of like wary for threats. And at first, like little things start coming out and attacking him. Angry humans, orcs, and things like that. And he's always on top. He kills them for a while, but eventually he realizes that if he just relaxes and doesn't attack anything, everything just kind of goes back to normal. So he starts to spend longer and longer in the machine. As he goes through the machine, having these weird experiences, you know, at first he's just kind of hanging out, not really doing very much, but over time he starts to build up things. He starts, okay, well, maybe I want like a space to sit. So he builds up like a little garden, and he finds that he actually likes gardening. He starts to build up a little temple, and he prays to the emperor, and he finds that he likes praying to the emperor in this little temple he's built. He finds that the more and more that he's just getting away from... Oh, it's kind of weird that I can just like see into their fortress from over here. But he finds that the more and more he spends time in there doing these things, the more he enjoys them, and he also finds that the more it like empowers him to explore further, to expand his vision for what's happening and all this other stuff. And he just keeps building and building and building, and eventually he starts to realize that he can actually kind of sort of create his ideal Marines while he's in there. So he starts creating his ideal Marine chapter while he's in there, and they start, you know, he starts basically building up his ideal society. And he finds very quickly that his ideal society, while it does have a lot of space marines in it, is not actually one that's founded entirely on war. It's not one that's found entirely on destruction and things like that. Like, he does spend some time going around breaking things, but he decides fairly quickly that it would probably be better if he, you know, went around and did other things. And he starts to realize that he likes building, he likes diplomacy, he likes talking about philosophy. And after a while, he starts to feel like he's been in here for like maybe a whole century, just by himself. He starts to think he maybe like never will come out, but he doesn't really know when he'll come out. But he's spent all of this time in there, and he just keeps getting better and better and understanding more and more, and he starts to feel more and more like he's being guided to learn something. And he starts to recognize various different things about himself and the galaxy at large. He starts to realize that the galaxy at large could be a better place if there were people like him who have seen like this vision of reality, this understanding that like everything doesn't have to be war, everything doesn't have to be terrible. And the more he thinks about it, the more he is kind of like comforted by this and starts to think about like, hey, it is kind of funny that they're just being constantly rocketed now. But he starts to think, hey, maybe I could actually spread this vision. And the longer he's going into this, he starts to learn more and more, and he feels, and the machine that he's like basically sitting in starts to tell him more things. It starts to give him more information. It starts to go through more things with him. It starts to give him more philosophy and more understanding about the universe, and it starts pointing him in new directions. And he's learning and kind of going through it, and he's taking time to consider if things come up and he doesn't 100% agree with them at first. He takes time to like ask questions. He finds that he can just kind of like ask questions, and machine will provide answers that he can find satisfactory or not satisfactory, you know. So he goes through this, and more he starts to consider like, what does he find a satisfactory answer, and what does he think makes sense and what doesn't make sense. For him as he's going through all this different stuff.
Build routine 721 initiated. Yes, most beneficent one.
Back up. Guys, back up. So you can get more support. No, get more support. Back up so you can get more support from more turrets and stuff. Yes, that.
Forward to victory. Forward to victory.
Wait, have I built so many turrets that they literally can't get back through there now? But yeah, so they kind of keep going through this stuff, and they keep exploring, and he keeps finding out more things about himself. And, you know, he's fairly certain that he's basically alone in this thing with...
Forward to victory.
Actually, wait.
Awaiting orders.
A task unfinished is a prayer unanswered.
Okay, so they can go back there. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Fury to share with the enemy. Under fire.
Yes, Lord.
At your command.
And the more he learns, the more he, well, the more he discovers not just about himself, but about like,
Ready. Charge.
wow, did they blow up all the turrets over there just from? Okay.
A task unfinished is a prayer unanswered. Remove that.
Land speeder deployed. Land speeder here.
Yeah.
Arrived.
There we go. Now it's doing a little better against all these guys. I guess I needed to put more anti-vehicle stuff over there.
I exist to serve. Build routine 721 initiated.
But yeah, so he starts to go through this. However, there is, after a very long time of doing all this different stuff and learning all this different stuff, he meets someone else in there. And that's the kind of shocking, surprising thing to him. He ends up meeting an Eldar. And at first when he sees that there's an Eldar in there, he's almost certain he didn't create it. So he's a little bit surprised at first, and not only surprised, but also like immediately kind of put on edge because he didn't put this Eldar in there. So that means either the machine put it in there or she's actually in there. And he starts, at first he considers attacking her, but since he spent so much time in here learning and figuring out that he doesn't always have to strike first, he decides that instead it would make more sense to just approach her and talk to her. He talks to her. He finds out that she was an Eldar that was also disillusioned with her craft world and with the way things were going. She was disillusioned with the Eldar race as a whole. And they kind of start to share, and the more they talk, they realize that they actually have a similar situation. And they end up spending time together, and they end up becoming basically friends. And the Eldar, you know, like, at first she has to overcome her, like, snobbiness towards, like, a quote-unquote lesser species, but this guy understands her better than a lot of her own kind do. And this lady now understands like some of his vision way better than he's almost certain any of his brothers ever would. So they start to, and as they start to spend more time together, they become better friends. Eventually, they get to a point where they really trust each other. But then they both start to ask, well, can we ever get out of this machine? Are we just stuck in here forever now that we've learned our lesson what happens? And the last thing that happens before they get out of the machine is that, well, basically a portal opens up and they now know that they can leave, or they're told that they can leave. And Zeki tells the Eldar lady where he is in the galaxy, and she says that she's going to come to them and she's going to try and convince her craft world to see what's different. Basically, on her end, she was plugged into a device that is very similar that the craft world had found. So after they go through all this different stuff, Zeki now has a new idea for what he wants the chapter to be, but not just the chapter. Like, he wants this whole, at the very least, the whole sector that they're in to change into. It turns out that the chaplain had actually sat in this chair before him, and it turns out that even though he felt like he had spent like a century in this thing, he had actually only spent like an hour. So he went through all this different stuff. He's not really 100% sure what happened. He doesn't really know, like, is this his device of Xenos origin? Is he being twisted and torn? Is he being tricked? And at first he does think maybe he was being tricked, but at the same time he's like, well, even if it was a trick, it was a damn good one, and the different reality that he's been shown seems like it's one that is like inherently worth fighting for more so than the one he currently occupies. So, well, that's interesting. You can do both the melta-gun and the rockets on that. That's interesting. I didn't know you could do that. So as all of this stuff goes on, he decides that it makes more and more sense to just go along with it instead of trying to resist it. He tells the chaplain about what he saw, and the chaplain says he saw similar visions, although he didn't have the experience of the Eldar, and that the chaplain has been shown a new spiritual path for them, and that he's been shown a lot of things, and that they should forge their new destiny together. So they decide to do it. They convince the other Marines to sit down in it. At first, some of them don't want to, But after they see that each one that gets in comes out much happier and like in a better position and things like that, and seems to know a lot of different things, more and more of them start to go through it. Until eventually there's like a small little group of these guys that have all gone through the machine and all seem to know like what's going on and have this better vision. They're all being shown also that Zeki is supposed to be the leader of this. More and more of the chapter gets involved in this until eventually it gets kind of suspicious among some of the chapter higher command. They manage to convince another captain to get into it, but at this point people are starting to get suspicious. Why are all these Marines behaving differently? Why are all these Marines gathering around? Why aren't they telling like higher chapter command about this? The chapter master ends up going down there, accuses them, and or well, not necessarily accuses them, but goes down there, finds out what they're doing, and decides that he doesn't want them doing this anymore. However, once they've all gone through this, they realize that there is no way back. They can't unsee what they've seen. They can't unsee that there is a better galaxy here, and that it would appear that this machine thinks that for one reason or another Zeki is the one that's supposed to lead them to it. That there's a new path for them, and that they can have a path that is not, you know, just war and misery, but actually something that is good for not just them, but good for all of the Imperium. So they tell the chapter master that he has to try it. He refuses, and they actually end up coming to blows. By this point, a rather large portion of the chapter had gone through the process. Almost 300 Marines. The chapter master probably should have noticed this beforehand, and he noticed it, but at first he thought they were just bonding and doing better things, and was distracted with other matters. But now he realizes that he should have intervened well before this.
Benevolence is for fools.
Benevolence is for fools. Yeah, that's like the opposite of the story I'm telling here, bud.
Primarch's honor.
But yeah, so they end up fighting. Zeki ends up slaying the chapter master, and now these Marines who have gone through this process over time, obviously, know that they have to do something to completely change the chapter. They realize that they have become traitors by slaying the chapter master, and of course they also slew some of the honor guard. But before the honor guard could go down and warn anybody, they slew them. They go through, and at first they're like, oh no, now we have to fight off the rest of the chapter. The chapter was already undernumbered because there was a lot of different combat they had been in. So there were only 700 Marines in this chapter, and several companies were out doing missions elsewhere. So, but still, that was still like 150 Marines or so that they would probably have to contend with. But at the time, seemingly of divine providence almost, a warp storm comes in and blocks off the system. This is right after the Eldar get into contact with Zeki and end up coming through in the webway. Very quickly, they take over the planet, fight off the brothers who don't want to go through the machine and don't want to like see the vision, or at least listen to them and give them a chance. And they have a little chapter civil war. They end up killing a bunch of their brothers, but some of them actually end up still coming over to their side. And then with the help of the Eldar, they're able to slay their brothers who don't want to go through the process and don't want to listen.
I am invincible.
You're invincible? That's pretty cool. Let's put that to the test, shall we?
Under fire.
But So they end up going through all of this, but now Zeki has to figure out what he's going to do in the rest of the system. Because he knows that he can't just take over just this planet, just the Space Marine planet, to take over the rest of it. So after they take over the planet, and after they get the Space Marines on their side, they use the cover of the warp storm to their advantage and start planning and going through and taking over other planets and bringing them on the side of the system, on the side of Zeki. They kill people who resist. They wipe out large portions of the Mechanicus and wipe out large portions of the old families. They use the cover of the warp storm to make sure that since each planet is kind of separate from each other and dealing with demons and other things, that they can, you know, enact their plan without having to worry too much about Oh jeez. It seems like it's slowing down a bit as we get over here. Oh, look at all these things fading in and out of existence. It's kind of funny. Sometimes the thing seems like it has a hard time running once all the mods are on, but still. But yeah, so they go through this, and they use the warp storm and their new Eldar allies to their advantage. They keep most of it out of like the eye of the public as much as they can. They basically say, look, all these guys were traitors and they are actually the reason the warp storm got brought on them, like in the upper command, the people that they didn't want. And they start weeding out the people that they can trust and weeding out the people they can't trust. For the next nearly 200 years, as this warp storm boils over everything, they have to fight off demons, and they're fighting amongst themselves, killing the people that they can't trust, and maneuvering in and around things. With the help of the Eldar, they're able to maintain their foothold and get to a point where they can actually, you know, create a decent stronghold for what they're trying to do. Oh man, my captain's gonna die here before this combat's over at this rate.
A task unfinished is a prayer unanswered.
But as everything goes along, eventually Zeki and the chapter is successful. Some of their brothers come back, but not very many. It turns out they were in the entire time fighting to try and get back inside the system, and were unsuccessful in losing lots of guys. They managed to convince the last remaining that what ended up happening to the chapter master was he was slain by demons, and that they had purged the system of a bunch of different traitors. And these last 50 either go through the machine or end up getting the Emperor's mercy. Now, with the obstacles out of the way, they begin to build up their new society. Really build it up. They had started, obviously, during the warp storm, but they started to build up their new society. They abuse imperial bureaucracy to their advantage to get extra supplies. They go through and they start building up more and more until they have a more advanced civilization. They start going through the ancient technology that they had previously. What is shooting my guys? Oh.
Remove that.
Yeah, let's go destroy that, since it keeps like shooting my guys from the back. And they're just like sitting there going, huh, that's kind of weird. Wonder if I'm getting shot.
Remove that. Remove that.
But yeah, so that's basically what they end up doing. They're going through all this different stuff and building it up over time. They learn how to hide themselves from like the Outer Imperium, or their real nature from the out of the Imperium. During all of this, the planet of Hadiz was completely scoured of life, and because there was a chaos incursion there that was very bad. So what they ended up doing is they scour it of life, and they ended up turning it into a new research station. The new Mechanicus that they have managed to get onto their side, as well as Xenos that the Eldar start pulling from different parts of the Ghoul stars, and eventually even some League of Votan as time goes on. They all kind of force them to come in and do their own research station with all this ancient technology. Or like they convince the League of Votan, they don't, some of these Leagues of Votan guys not actually force them, which is a small number. And they all come in and they start working on technology on this small planet, and they start slowly building up and creating a new system. They mostly keep isolated as much as they possibly can to prevent people from noticing how like far out of like the norm these guys are now. Because now that they've embraced this new path, what they realized is that they are traitors in a sense. The average citizen on the ground doesn't really realize like how much these guys have gone out of their way to build up a new society and how much they're like doing different things. But they build up this new society, they're building up their chapter, and they also build up the chapter beyond its normal limits. And they kind of go through all of these different changes, and now they are kind of their own separate society. They, on the surface level, pretend to be loyal to the Imperium and all that still, but they're not really. They're much more out for themselves. Zeki ends up learning more and more about the chapter's history, ends up finding out that they're not actually Ultramarine stock, they're actually Dark Angel stock, which isn't the most tremendous deal ever, although it's just one more nail in the coffin and shows him that the Imperium is, you know, like, it's so backwater and so bureaucratic that it doesn't even know where where like its space marines are coming from, etc. And so he starts to build up more and more technology. He creates a home for the Eldar. He hides the Eldar, you know, out there among the Ghoul stars. They explore the Ghoul stars, start looking for new and interesting bits of technology, and their idea is that they may eventually get to a point where Pelman discovers them, and that they're going to have to fight back against the Imperium itself. They come up with contingency plans, and they also start to get to a point where they manipulate things around themselves to give themselves more cover. They end up having guys who talk a lot like lawyers, and learn how to manipulate and move things around so that when Inquisitors or other people come from outside to investigate them, at first they seem particularly loyal and fine, even though the system itself is building up and getting very advanced and very obviously doing things that other systems aren't. And then, when Imperium Nihilus ends up becoming a thing, when the Cicatrix Maledictum basically cuts the galaxy in half and they end up being separated from, this actually works to their advantage. Because now they're even more hidden, and they can stay even more hidden and just build up their society even more. They raise the living standards of the average citizen so that it's above average. They make it so that everyone around them can live a better life, and they mostly keep people loyal by giving them better lives and giving them reasons that they would want to stay in the system and fight for the system. They use various different orders, and they use various different groups of loyalists within these on the different planets to maneuver and keep people in line. They rename themselves to the Rift Drakes. They now have the Drake Guard, and various different houses, the noble houses have been put through the machine and forced to work for Zeki now. And basically the entire system is being watched over by the Space Marines now, and they're focusing resources to various different things. They have realized that the Imperium is probably going to drift away eventually, and they're just using the resources and time they have to build up, so they have their own separate power structure and forces. They don't work against the Imperium, and for a while before the Cicatrix Maledictum separated them, they would still go out and help fight with the Imperium, and, you know, they didn't want Imperial planets lost, but they did all that mostly to keep themselves out of suspicion and to keep people from noticing that they're doing all this weird stuff and they're like playing around with alien technology and things like that. They're also very closely working with the craft world led by that Farseer. They have a hard time coming up with a name for the Farseer's craft world because I was trying to find the Eldar name for like Split Rain or something like that, but I you know, like basically it's a craft world where they really like having like almost like tropical temperatures inside the craft world. And I might get into them at a later date, but they're working together. This also allows these Marines to use the webway occasionally to move around and collect technology and to move and do secret missions to further their own goals without directly interfering with the normal warp travel and stuff like that. Of course, they can't really let people know that they're using the webway, and they have to go through all kinds of different means to make sure that people don't notice them. But that's the main thing that they're going through. They have their own spiritual path. They worship their own goddess, kind of thing. And that's the part where, like, it kind of differs from the lore, like the official lore a little bit, in that they worship their own goddess type thing. And yeah, there's probably a lot more you go into, but that's like the basic background and basic backstory. Now they have their own things where they like have their own small Mechanicus loyal to them after they purged a bunch of people who weren't basically xenophiles. But they managed to find a decent number, and they've built them up back up over time. They have their own guys doing all this research on this separate planet, playing around with their ancient stockhold of technology, bribing people with technology, that sort of thing. Occasionally they've had to kill Inquisitors or like misdirect Inquisitors around them. They mostly try to misdirect them, but if they really absolutely have to, they'll kill an Inquisitor. That kind of thing. So yeah, that's the basic backstory for the Rift Drakes. There's actually way more detail and stuff I could go into, but this video is already almost an hour long. And I just thought it would be fun to like share my babblings and my ideas about these guys. At some point I might actually write all this stuff down because I really enjoy messing around with it and talking about it. But you know, that's just what I'm going to do for now. Yeah, they hang out in the Ghoul Stars, hang out with all kinds of weird tiny Xenos species, and they hang out with Eldar and other things like that, and that kind of makes people very suspicious of them. They're not officially allied with the Eldar, but you know, people have noticed, like it was starting to become a problem before the Cicatrix Maledictum, that some people noticed that the Eldar seemed to be present there quite frequently. And their excuse was basically, yeah, we occasionally work with them and they've been helpful to us and they're, you know, helping us protect the Imperium type thing. Never really going into the full extent of their actual relationship with the Eldar, or that they actually use some Eldari technology and things like that. So yeah, hopefully you guys thought that was interesting, and hopefully you don't just scream heresy at me, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope that maybe, if people like this, I can produce some more stuff going into more detail about the Rift Drakes. Alright, thanks. Bye-bye.